It's one of the greatest archaeological finds of all time. Egypt's only intact pharaoh's tomb, whose treasures compare with those of the fabled King Tut. This find could lift the veil on one of the darkest periods of Egyptian history. But chances are you've never even heard of it. Today, the artifacts and treasures are being restudied. The pharaoh's remains re-examined.
I'm actually very excited to an extent that I can't speak.
All our past assumptions may be overthrown as we enter into the mysteries of Egypt's Silver Pharaoh. It's February 1940. Adolf Hitler has launched his blitzkrieg in Europe. The first savage blows in a war which will soon engulf the world. For the moment, Egypt is remote from the battlefield. At an excavation site near the Nile, a French archaeology team has been toiling for more than a decade. Now they're racing to complete their work before war heads their way. Professor Pierre Montet, the archaeologist leading the team, is reporting on an extraordinary discovery. He's discovered a pharaoh whom few people have even heard of, from an era few people know anything about. What he's found here will rewrite the story of ancient Egypt. Pierre Montet had been looking for clues to explain one of the most mysterious periods in Egyptian history, around 1000 BC. It's a dark passage in a story which spans 3 millennia. Egypt's Great Pyramid was built by Pharaoh Khufu in what's called the 4th dynasty. The most famous pharaohs, people like Tutankhamun and Ramses the Great, ruled more than 1,000 years later in the 18th and 19th dynasties. The last of the pharaohs, Cleopatra, ruled another 1,000 years after that. Dr. Peter Lacavara is an Egyptologist, using the evidence of inscriptions and hieroglyphs to chart this immense period of time.
If you think about it, in history's timeline, Cleopatra is actually closer to us than she was to the people who built the pyramids.
It's reckoned that Egypt has been ruled by at least 170 pharaohs. But for many, there's little hard evidence. The tombs of 70 pharaohs have never yet been found. They might lie anywhere in Egypt's ancient burial grounds beside the River Nile, in the Valley of the Kings, at ancient Thebes, beside modern-day Luxor, at the old capital of Memphis, close to where Cairo is today. Or maybe in the far north, the Delta, where the Nile splits into branches on its way to the sea. For Egyptologists, filling gaps in this timeline is harder still, because there were periods when Egypt was in chaos. For 500 years, competing rulers were fighting for dominance in what's known as an intermediate period, Egypt's Dark Age.
In the intermediate period, we have economic downturn, we have civil war, the country split between north and south, even threat of foreign invasion. Civil discord is bad for archaeologists. We don't have the great monuments, the historical inscriptions, the private statues. People are just too busy trying to stay alive.
The lack of archaeological evidence makes this an era whose story is yet to be completed. And yet it coincides in time with some of the best-known stories in the world. Scholars place the Old Testament battle between David and Goliath right around this time, at 1020 BC. The Bible tells how a pharaoh of this era invaded the Holy Land around 950 BC.
On this wall we have Shoshank I, who's recorded in the Bible as Shishak, who sacked the Temple of Solomon and brought the Ark of the Covenant back to Egypt.
These tantalizing stories, linking Egypt and the Holy Land, are what inspires Pierre Montet. He begins digging in 1928 at Tanis in the Nile Delta. Other archaeologists have already dug here, but Montet believes there could be important finds still to be uncovered. Before very long, Montet's hunch begins to pay off. Through the 1930s, he uncovers the remains of a vast temple with inscriptions showing it was dedicated to Egypt's supreme god, Amun. The temple compound is protected by a massive mud brick wall, inside which, Montet figures, there could be tombs waiting to be discovered. Hollywood even imagined the Lost Ark could be buried in Tanis. But, a little like Indiana Jones, Montet has to deal with a threat from the Nazis. The world is on the brink of war, with Adolf Hitler threatening to unleash his stormtroopers at any moment.
Although Montet had found a great many carved blocks, pieces of temples and things, he hadn't found anything truly spectacular that would set the world alight. At the same time, there were all these rumblings of war in Europe, so he was always casting half an eye backwards to see what was going on. So it must have been an incredibly tense time for him.
In Tanis, Montet's diggers have almost completed their sweep of the temple compound when they come to a spot close to the mud brick wall. Montet quickly scrambles down into the tomb. In the shadows, he can make out a whole series of burial chambers. But his worst fears are quickly confirmed.
Montet's heart must have been sinking when he came in here because there was a hole in the roof and there wasn't supposed to have been one. So obviously it must mean that tomb robbers had made their way here before he had.
It's a royal tomb, dating from around 850 BC.
The inscriptions said that this tomb belonged to Asorkon II, who was a pharaoh of the 22nd dynasty, and also some of his relatives were buried here. So it was a find, and in fact a significant find, but it certainly wasn't an unrobbed, intact royal burial.
Montet's a realist. In all the history of exploration in Egypt, no archaeologist has ever found an unrobbed pharaoh's tomb. But he's not going to quit.
Montet ordered his workmen to extend the excavation area to about right here, only 10 yards away.
There's a second tomb complex, right alongside the one which had been ransacked. Montet can hardly believe it. But this time, the tomb appears to be intact.
It's surprising that the tomb robbers who so successfully robbed this tomb missed the one over there that's only a few yards away. Maybe they didn't realize that there was a whole mass of graves around here. But that would be surprising because tomb robbers were astonishingly good at reading the landscape. and could ferret out tombs when even archaeologists have a hard time doing that.
Monte still can't be sure who's buried here. But then, as he enters the antechamber, the answer appears.
Imagine Monte's excitement when he stood at this very spot and shone the light up here and saw a royal name. Barkham Partham Newt. And that means the star is rising in the city, beloved of the god Amun. And then he saw other royal names, because pharaohs had a panoply of royal names. And here is great other manifestations of Re, chosen of the god Amun. So here we have a pharaoh's tomb, which seemed to be intact. And this pharaoh is really known by his Greek name, Susenes I.
To Monte, Susenes is a mysterious figure, one of a string of pharaohs whose life and times aren't fully understood. The intermediate period, when power was divided, lasted more than 500 years. Susenes reigned near the beginning of this chaotic era. He ruled the north of Egypt, from here in Tanis. Yet the real power and wealth lay down south, in the ancient capital of Thebes. The Theban rulers are well documented from the monuments and treasures they left behind. But who were these northern kings? Petty warlords or significant pharaohs, due a place in history? If Susenes' tomb really is intact, then Monte can fill one of the yawning gaps in Egypt's story. The doorway of the burial chamber itself is still tightly sealed, with a massive block of solid granite. It takes 6 days of back-breaking toil to shatter this into pieces. Then, at last, Monte can enter the tomb itself. It's all he could ever have hoped for.
Monte said the tomb was filled with marvels worthy of the 1001 Nights, and indeed it was, because on the floor of the tomb right here, there were hundreds of figurines. There were gemstones, precious metals.
Monte knows he's the first person to touch these treasures since they were put here 3,000 years ago. This photograph, taken moments after Monte entered, is exactly what he saw. There's no sign yet of a mummy or casket. They lie, as is typical in pharaonic tombs, inside a huge stone sarcophagus, which almost fills the chamber. It's carved and covered in hieroglyphs. The massive lid is now displayed here in the Egyptian Museum. Inside this, another sarcophagus, also richly carved. Monte and his team have to carefully prise open these granite sarcophagi to reveal the pharaoh's actual casket within. When news of the find emerges, Monte is told to expect a very important guest. The King of Egypt himself. King Farouk has been supporting Monte's expedition and shows up at the dig dressed every inch the explorer. Monte's agreed to leave the most important find, Susenes' casket, sealed until the king himself arrives to behold the incredible discovery. The cartouche shows the signature of the man who was Egypt's king 3,000 years before. But King Farouk wants to see treasure, not carvings. He's been promised something unique, totally unlike what he's so often seen on other digs before. He's not disappointed. The casket is a human form forged in silver instead of the familiar gold. Nothing like it has ever been found before or since. Here lies a little-known ruler from Egypt's turbulent Dark Age. But his tomb and its riches seem to put him alongside the mightiest of pharaohs. What lies inside the silver casket confirms this enigma. Susene's death mask is solid gold. This is no small-time warlord or regional strongman, but someone with enormous wealth and power.
Well, it's not just gold and silver that's in Susene's tomb, but lapis lazuli, and in huge quantities. Far more than in Tutankhamun's tomb. And this was material that had to be imported from Afghanistan, 3,000 miles away. So incredibly prized and incredibly valuable.
The treasures are stamped with the pharaoh's distinctive cartouche. The star, representing Susenes, rising over the city of Tanis. Their value isn't simply in the quantity of precious metal, but the quality of the craftsmanship.
They're beautifully made, beautifully designed. Clearly for an individual who could appreciate this great aesthetics.
Monte would like months to meticulously examine all that he's found. But he doesn't have that luxury. He's made the find of a lifetime, but his timing could not be worse. Hitler's armies are poised on the borders of France. Invasion can only be weeks away. Monte orders the excavation site to be shut down, rushes back to his family in France, and won't return to Egypt for another 5 years. The treasures from Susene's tomb are transported to Cairo for safekeeping. Though it's one of the great moments in archaeology, Monte's discovery of Susenes barely makes a ripple.
There was war going on in Europe, so who's going to pay any attention to an archaeological find in Egypt? Because of this, even today, we don't really know enough about Monte's amazing discovery.
When Tutankhamun was unearthed, back in 1922, it made headlines around the world. When his mummy was examined, the cameras were there too. It was a grand affair, conducted by the professor of anatomy at Cairo University, Professor Douglas Derry. In 1940, Professor Derry receives another invite. An obscure pharaoh called Susenes has turned up in the north. Or at least, bits of him have.
He was buried in the Nile Delta, which is a very wet, damp environment, while other people were buried in the Valley of the Kings, which is in the desert. So anyone buried in the Delta is prone to decompose because of the dampness. It's very difficult to study mummies that were buried there.
Derry carries out what now looks like a cursory examination. He can tell straight away that Susenes died an old man, but he misses further important evidence. Then the bones are buried again, this time not in a royal tomb, but deep in the university's archives. For 70 years, Susene's bones lay unstudied and unheralded. But now, Dr. Fawzi Gabala, Derry's successor as Professor of Anatomy, will reopen the examination.
I'm actually very excited to an extent that I can't speak. There is nothing published in detail about this skeleton, which could explain his state of health and way of living.
Evidence from that first examination is here. The smaller bones are still inside Professor Derry's old cigarette packets. Although the soft tissue is gone, Susene's bones reveal plenty about the pharaoh. He stood 1.66 meters tall and was powerfully built. As Derry noted, Susenis died a very old man, perhaps approaching 80, at a time when the average lifespan was nearer 35. Wear and tear in the teeth confirmed Derry's opinion. But astonishing new information emerges from the professor's examination. In particular, from this seventh cervical vertebra, part of the king's backbone.
This is a new finding which I discovered during my examination. This spine is broken and healed during the life of the king, and now it is healed. Look at the irregularity, look at the bend of the spine. It is not mentioned by Professor Derry. I discovered it, and this is called a type of fracture, it's called Chauvel's fracture. And it may point to the fact that this king was not living a sedentary life. This fracture usually indicates hard work with the upper limbs.
Susene's broken upper vertebra had healed over time. But there's evidence of chronic disease in the lower backbone.
This king was suffering from a disease of connective tissue, a rheumatic disease, in the form of ossification of the ligaments of the vertebral column. Professor Derry mentioned this, but didn't diagnose the cause of this.
This first detailed examination of Susene's bones provides important new insight into his life. And now, for the first time, a forensic artist will gauge what Susenis may actually have looked like.
What is absolutely fascinating to anyone looking at this head is his right eye appears slightly higher than the left one. The socket is actually set higher, so this cheekbone starts higher and is set higher there than this one. It must be reflected in the face.
Melissa Dring holds a degree in the psychology of facial identification and trained in forensic reconstruction with the FBI. Dead for 3,000 years, the Silver Pharaoh is about to come alive.
Susenis. Here he is. He's physically extremely well built. He's got a large head on a fairly short body, but he's not been shy of using his body in energetic exercise of some kind. He's also lost a lot of teeth on both sides, so you have something of the sort of the nutcracker look, because the jaw is able to close more firmly. It's a determined mouth. It's a no-nonsense look, I think.
The fact that Susenis lived so long, despite his medical history, tells Egyptologists that above all, he was a survivor.
The fact that he was physically strong and long-lived absolutely must have contributed to his success as a ruler. He managed to reign for 46 years, which was a very long time. People like Tutankhamun died when they were teenagers. So someone like Susenes really could make a difference.
Susenes' 46-year reign makes him one of the longest-serving of all Egypt's pharaohs. The treasures from his tomb, and now his physical remains, have yielded a mass of new evidence. But Egyptologists still struggle to interpret this dark age around 1000 BC, when pharaohs like Susenes had to share power with rivals in the south of the kingdom.
It's ironic, but this dark age in Egyptian history followed a period when the pharaohs were at their greatest height of power.
The seeds of turmoil during the reign of Susenes were sown 200 years earlier by the most powerful pharaoh of them all.
Egypt reached the peak of its power under Ramses II, Ramses the Great. He was a prolific builder, the greatest builder Egypt had ever seen, and had as many as 100 children.
Before Ramses, Egypt had just 2 power centers: Thebes and Memphis. Ramses' boundless ambition led him to build an entirely new capital in the Nile Delta. He called it Pyrames, the House of Ramses. But Ramses had been playing a dangerous game.
The Delta region was really a frontier area for Egypt before Ramses really started to colonize it and build his great capital there. It sort of threw things off balance. While a strong central ruler like Ramses the Great could maintain control, once you had a weak ruler, you could see the Delta kind of flying off on its own.
The trouble began here in Thebes. The only figure powerful enough to challenge a pharaoh was Egypt's high priest, in charge of the vast temple of Karnak.
In some ways, the term high priest is a bit misleading because he was more than just a religious official. He ran a big business, which is what this temple was. He was an important political leader, and he could even command military might.
The priest's power was founded on the belief that they influenced what happened, even in the afterlife.
A king would leave an estate to the temple, and then the priests of the temple would maintain his cult, would maintain his monuments, keep his memory alive, which was essential to the Egyptians.
Kings, to win their favor, would give them rights to fishing and fowling and hunting, or rights to mines, or even trade along the Nile. And so the priesthood gained increasing amounts of wealth.
They were just getting wealthier and wealthier as time went on, until they eventually decided, why don't we become king?
The challenge from the priests hit crisis point shortly before Susenes came to power.
Here's the high priest shown at almost the same height as the pharaoh. You can see the other priests are much shorter, and previously in Egypt, everyone was shorter than the pharaoh to show their relative status. But here, the high priest has gained so much power that he's almost equivalent to the pharaoh.
5 centuries of chaos, the intermediate period, ensued when Egypt was riven in 2. The high priest seized the south. The pharaoh was exiled to the frontier region, the Delta. A checkpoint was established on the Nile, close to Memphis. So how did Susenes turn his small northern province into a rich domain fit for a king? Investigators go back to the treasures from Susenes' tomb, looking for clues. critical evidence is spotted on this small, seemingly insignificant silver dish, called a patera. Investigators noted Susene's familiar signature, including the star and bird. But this time, the cartouche contains a long series of further symbols.
The inscription on the patera reads, "Life to the perfect God, Lord of the two lands, the high priest of Amun, king of the gods, beloved of Amun," and then Susenes. What's very important about this is the fact that we know from this bowl that he held the title of high priest of Amun in the north.
Suddenly, by decoding these hieroglyphs, it all makes sense. Susenes was more than just a pharaoh. He was a high priest as well. The mystery of his fabulous treasure hoard is revealed at last.
A pharaoh would traditionally derive his wealth from taxes. If you were a farmer, and that was most of the people of Egypt, you would have to give a certain proportion of your crop yield to the treasury of the pharaoh. As we've seen, the high priest was getting wealthier than the pharaoh. But this way, he's combining both sources of income, the wealth of the temple as well as the traditional wealth of the pharaoh.
But how did Susenes carve out such a powerful position? It becomes clear looking at the family connections among Egypt's ruling clan. The trail leads to the man who played godfather amidst the turmoil. High priest and strongman Pinedjem.
Pinedjem was high priest here in the Temple of Karnak around 1070 BC. He had 4 sons, 3 of whom succeeded him as high priest. And one, Susenes, went to Tanis where he became pharaoh. But he was also given the title high priest of Amun in the north.
Susenes was a smart politician, determined to play on those powerful family connections.
The records indicate that Susenes sent his daughter to Thebes to marry his own brother when he succeeded to become high priest of Karnak, and therefore cemented further the relations between the north and the south.
What is emerging is not some dark age of chaos and strife, but something much different. By using his family connections, making political marriages and key alliances, Susenes won wealth and power. But having won it, the question now is, how did he wield it? Recent discoveries prove that Susenes was the driving force for one of the most extraordinary feats of ancient times. Relocating a metropolis, stone by stone. The exact location of Ramses II's fabled capital, Pyramus, was one of the world's great archaeological mysteries. A city of about 250,000 people, one of the largest in the ancient world, vanished in the sands.
This was really the holy grail of Egyptian archaeology for many decades. Find Pyramus.
In the 1930s, before he ever got to Susenes' tomb, as Pierre Montet turned up more and more ancient relics at Tanis, an amazing possibility began to slowly take shape in his mind. Had he found the archaeologist's holy grail?
Montet was absolutely convinced that he had found the missing city of Pyramus, and so he went on record saying that Tanis and Pyramus were one and the same. And the reason he did this was because there were lots and lots of blocks and statues that he found here bearing the name of Ramses II, just like this one. Here you can see the cartouche, royal name of Ramses II. So all of these cartouches that were scattered about through the entire site convinced Monte that here we have the city of Pyramus.
For Monte and archaeologists worldwide, this discovery was far more significant than even uncovering a royal tomb. But Monte had made one critical mistake. His theory sounded good, because Tanis was a riverside city. And ancient records showed that Pyramus was also beside the Nile. But in Egypt's delta country, the River Nile doesn't just stay put. It has many branches. And they switch location over time as one area silts up and another is flooded. In the 1970s, archaeologists began to question Monte's findings. They homed in on a small settlement 20 kilometers from Tanis. New evidence pointed to a long-lost branch of the Nile, which Monte had discounted.
They started to dig and found a huge cache of Ramesside period pottery. So they brought in ground-penetrating radar to check out the site. The scans revealed a huge city.
The city's foundations showed up on these scans. The Nile, where it had once flowed, and the ghostly image of Ramses' lost city. There'd been a temple here, as well as military installations.
They even found the stables of Ramses II. They were huge, and they must have had hundreds of horses in them. In fact, where they used to practice, we even have found the hoof prints of the horses when they were running around. So it really was an incredibly large, complex city, which had all the hallmarks of Ramses' capital.
Today, not even the foundations are visible above ground. And the vast buildings have totally disappeared. But why? And to where? Archaeologists now know that this branch of the Nile became so badly silted up that it switched direction. Pyramus was literally high and dry. Life there became unsustainable. The record shows it happened around the time that Susenis came to the throne, 1047 BC. And so he had the great monuments dismantled and shifted to Tanis. Susenis may not deserve credit for building a capital city, but he did rescue one.
Imagine what a vast undertaking this must have been. It would have been like moving the monuments of Washington, D.C., the White House, the Lincoln Memorial, being dragged halfway to Baltimore.
Without the radar scans, Susenis' amazing feat may never have emerged. Monte had found the great relics of Ramses' fabled city. It's just that they were in a totally different place. Comparing remains found here with the scans, archaeologists can see that the temple at Pyramus was built to the same pattern as the one Monte unearthed at Tanis. Here's where Susenis carried out his dual office as high priest and king of the north. He'd co-opted the city of Ramses the Great in a way that shows he had power and the skill to wield it.
This is clear evidence that Susenis had the workforce and organization, a good bureaucracy, to move a city from one place to another. He also had the gumption and the chutzpah to make this new city come alive.
Susenis' power and wealth and his long reign gave him the luxury of planning the most important decision a pharaoh had to make: how to face the afterlife. The choice of which objects to take to the tomb was an important one. What Egyptologists wonder is, why did he choose silver for his casket? For ancient Egyptians, gold was known as the flesh of the gods. Its ability not to rust or tarnish gave it the appearance of lasting forever, like the gods themselves. Silver was termed the bones of the gods, on account of its pale appearance. Ancient Egypt had natural gold reserves, but silver was scarce. In the early dynasties, it was considered more precious. But by Susenis' era, Egypt had developed trade links. Foreign merchants were offering what was once so rare in Egypt: silver. By 1000 BC, its value had declined to roughly half that of gold. Susenis could clearly afford the best. Some of his treasures even rival those of Tutankhamun. John Privet, who's both an archaeologist and a silversmith, has studied the question, why silver?
It would have been cheaper, not as expensive as gold, but the amount of work and the craft involved was considerable. Silver is a harder material, less malleable than gold to work. Silver requires to be heated every now and again to soften the crystalline structure of it, to then carry on working it. A repeated process which involves time, labour, fuel. The craftsmanship involved is certainly more intense than gold.
Susenis may have been demonstrating his power as well as his wealth. The casket was made from more than 90 kilograms of pure silver. The body section was beaten from sheets of silver, so thin and delicate in places that it was damaged during removal from the tomb. The head section is much thicker. Telltale marks around the nose and mouth suggest that it was cast in a mold, then hammered into shape. The Egyptians are known to have mastered the art of casting precious metals. From the first rough cast, looking like this, Susenis craftsmen then had to polish and sculpt their pharaoh's features, a process which took hundreds of hours of painstaking work. Today, the silver casket is one of the great treasures of the Egyptian Museum, a permanent reminder of Pierre Montet's amazing find. He died in 1966, still believing that the city he'd unearthed was Pyramus. But his remarkable discovery of Susenis' tomb remains one of the key moments in archaeology. Susenis has never enjoyed the fame of Ramses or Tutankhamun, but his star is rising. Investigators are now taking on the work that Montet began and lifting the veil on what was considered Egypt's dark age.
Susenis was really an incredible man. He moved the capital city from one place to the next. He also managed to build a spectacular tomb for himself, which withstood the ravages of time as well as the attentions of tomb robbers. He needs to be re-evaluated, and we need to pay more attention to this remarkable pharaoh of the 21st dynasty.
Susenis will have believed that by commanding such an elaborate burial, he was buying a ticket to immortality. 3,000 years later, we can look back and say, that's exactly what he's done.